Why did the Trump administration's USCIS grant asylum last year to the shooter just months before this deadly attack? We do have witnesses from several inspector general's offices, but President Trump fired the heads of those two offices, and I'm concerned these offices may now be reluctant to criticize Trump administration action.
Senator Dick Durbin warns that a horrific act of violence is being used to justify sweeping immigration crackdowns that punish entire communities. As he honors fallen service members, Durbin turns his focus to a deeper issue: whether America is abandoning the very allies who risked their lives to protect U.S. troops. What follows is not just a policy argument. It is a moral challenge to how the nation treats those who stood beside it in war.
This hearing was scheduled in the aftermath of a horrific tragedy on November 26 when a gunman ambushed two National Guard members here in Washington. I offer my deepest condolences to the family of Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, who lost her life in that attack, and I'm keeping Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf in my thoughts and prayers, as I'm sure many are. At the outset, I want to note my disappointment that there are no witnesses here today representing the executive branch agencies that are responsible for vetting immigrants. There are many questions we would ask them. The lead question is obvious. Why did the Trump administration's USCIS grant asylum last year to the shooter just months before this deadly attack? We do have witnesses from several inspector general's offices, but President Trump illegally fired the heads of those two offices, and I'm concerned these offices may now be reluctant to criticize Trump administration action. Unfortunately, the administration has used the heinous actions of one person to paint an entire community as a threat to America. 2 days before this tragedy, the administration ordered a review of all refugees who entered the United States under the previous president, requiring a re-interview of nearly 200,000 people. 200,000. After the shooting, the Trump administration announced a flurry of additional measures to crack down on legal immigrants. They halted all asylum decisions and announced a plan to re-examine green cards for immigrants from 39 countries the president has deemed countries of concern, including Afghanistan. The administration also began canceling naturalization interviews and ceremonies based on an individual's country of origin, and they suspended visa and immigration processing for all from Afghanistan. Listen to what Chris Purdy, a veteran who served in Iraq, said about the Trump administration policies, and I quote, "Tragedy should not be used to flatten complex realities, erase years of life-saving work, or cast suspicion on an entire community that stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States in our longest war." Afghan allies are extensively vetted population. They were vetted in Afghanistan before they were hired to work, to stand beside and help protect our troops. They were vetted again when seeking safety in the United States. Sometimes that vetting went on for months and longer, and again after they arrived through a rigorous, recurring process involving multiple federal agencies. These allies served alongside America's service members through 2 decades of war. They risked their lives, and many gave their lives to support our troops. So what happened to these allies, these friends, those who stood behind us when they needed our support? Let's look to our veterans for that perspective. The Iraq and Afghan Veterans of America conducted a survey of their members last fall. More than 70% of the respondents disagreed with the following statement. Disagreed. Since 2001, the United States government has done enough to support our Afghan allies. It is obvious to those who served that we owe so much more to these allies. When asked about the detention of Afghans who were going through the immigration process, 70% of respondents agreed that the detentions brought them, quote, a deep sense of personal shame or moral injury. They know that we treated them badly. Our service members need to know that when they're in the line of fire and depending on foreign allies to protect their lives, that the United States will stand by those allies after the confrontation. Who will put their lives on the line for our service members in the next war after watching our treatment of Afghan allies who were detained and deported to a country where they could be imprisoned or killed for their work with us? America is better for those service members having returned home, and America is better for their Afghan allies who now call our nation home. It is time for us to stand behind those who put their lives on the line for our service members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This exchange is rooted in grief, responsibility, and a broader concern about how tragedy is being transformed into policy. Senator Durbin begins by acknowledging the human cost of violence, offering condolences to the families of fallen National Guard members. But he quickly shifts to a deeper institutional question: how the federal government responds after tragedy, and whether fear is being allowed to drive decisions that reach far beyond the individual responsible. Durbin expresses frustration that no executive branch witnesses responsible for immigration vetting were present to answer fundamental questions. The absence itself becomes part of the story. Without direct accountability from agencies tasked with screening and oversight, the narrative is left to be shaped by political messaging rather than transparent explanation. This gap, Durbin suggests, makes it easier to redirect public anger toward entire communities rather than toward specific system failures. The senator challenges the logic of collective punishment. In response to a single act of violence, sweeping measures were ordered to review nearly 200,000 refugees and to halt or slow legal immigration processes for people from multiple countries. These actions, Durbin argues, go far beyond reasonable security responses and instead create a framework in which lawful immigrants and vetted allies are treated as presumptive threats. A central theme of Durbin's remarks is the extensive vetting Afghan allies already endured. He emphasizes that these individuals were screened repeatedly before working with U.S. forces, during relocation, and again after arrival in the United States. This multi-layered process, involving numerous federal agencies, undermines claims that Afghan allies represent an unchecked security risk. By highlighting this, Durbin reframes the issue from one of inadequate screening to one of political narrative construction. The inclusion of veterans' voices adds a powerful moral dimension. Durbin references survey data showing that a majority of veterans believe the United States has not done enough to support Afghan allies. Even more striking is the sense of moral injury expressed by service members who view the detention and mistreatment of Afghan partners as a betrayal of shared sacrifice. These are not abstract opinions. They come from individuals who fought alongside these allies and depended on them in life or death situations. At its core, Durbin's argument is about trust. Military operations rely on cooperation with local partners who take enormous personal risks to assist U.S. forces. If those partners see that America abandons or punishes allies after the conflict ends, future cooperation becomes far less likely. The damage is not only humanitarian, it is strategic. The credibility of U.S. commitments is weakened when promises to protect partners are not honored. Durbin also challenges the use of tragedy to justify policies that reshape immigration systems broadly. By tying sweeping restrictions to a single event, he warns that complex realities are being flattened into simplistic explanations. This approach, he suggests, replaces evidence-based policymaking with reaction-driven measures that may feel decisive, but fail to address root causes. The broader implication is that national security and moral responsibility are inseparable. Protecting the country requires effective screening, intelligence work, and intervention when warning signs appear. But it also requires honoring commitments to those who stood with U.S. forces. When allies are treated as liabilities rather than partners, the message sent to the world is clear and damaging. This exchange ultimately becomes a test of national character. Durbin frames the issue not just as an immigration debate, but as a reflection of whether the United States stands by those who stood by it. The question he leaves hanging is not merely about policy efficiency, but about values. Whether fear will override fairness, and whether political convenience will override long-standing commitments forged in war. At its core, this moment is a reminder that how a nation treats its allies after the fighting ends says as much about its strength as how it conducts the fight itself. Durbin's remarks challenge viewers to consider whether America's response reflects its highest principles, or whether tragedy is being used to justify choices that weaken both trust and honor.